Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I decided to dust off my Winsor Newton Cotman palette and compare it to the Daniel Smith Watercolor Essentials set I've been using for the last few months in a side-by-side mixed media study to illustrate the pros and cons of each set. Let's start with the full list of supplies I used. These include Arch's cold pressed watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 set of Polychromos color pencils, a paper blending stump, a white Jelly Roll gel pen, a Derwent pencil extender, the Winsor Newton 12-pan Cotman sketch set, the Daniel Smith Watercolor Essentials set, size 6 and 12 sable round brushes, and a plastic mixing palette. I'm jumping straight to the comparisons this time, but if you want a slower, more chill look at my process, check out my Draw With Me playlist. Starting with the initial wet-on-wet wash, the Cotman watercolors laid down smoothly and spread in an even gradation. I mixed up similar colors for the Daniel Smith half of the study, and that produced similar results. The only notable difference in this stage is that the Cotman colors tend to create one mostly even tone, while the Daniel Smith colors blend while also retaining some of each color's original hue in the areas you drop them in. The differences start to become more apparent in these next few layers. Cotman colors blend beautifully using a wet-on-dry technique, but struggle a bit with larger areas. I think this might be due to drying times. Cotman watercolor pans can be difficult to re-wet, and I've noticed even watery mixtures dry quickly on my mixing palette. Cotton cold pressed paper gives me the longest working time with watercolors, but even here, I only had a minute or so before the Cotman colors started forming hard edges. In contrast, the Daniel Smith colors took 3 to 4 minutes before they dried to a damp consistency. It was easier to fill larger areas, partially because of the longer dry time, but also because my mixtures were just more pigmented. Building on this layer was also easy. I could lay down concentrated pigment and then take a clean brush to soften off the edges. As I got into the rendering phase, I remembered something I'd forgotten. Cotman colors lift. This can be a pro or con depending on your painting style and favorite techniques. If an area turned out too dark, like the edge of one of the arms, I could lighten it by pressing and dragging a clean brush against the area, then wiping off the paint with a paper towel. Unfortunately, this can also cause issues if you want to get darker values. Sometimes I'd accidentally reactivate an area when glazing colors, which would lift the pigment and create an uneven light patch underneath. In order to avoid this, I had to use more pigmented, thicker paint mixtures with my Cotman set, much like painting with gouache. Meanwhile, the Daniel Smith paints glazed wonderfully, adding color and depth to the shadows of the forms, while also retaining their saturation and luminosity. The paints in this Daniel Smith mixing set tend to be staining, at least on cold and hot press watercolor paper. This means I can't erase or lift mistakes, but I can layer many times. When I combine this glazing ability with longer dry times, I found myself creating smoother transitions, capturing more forms, and just generally slowing down into a flow state. I was able to capture fine details with both paints, but it was definitely easier with the Daniel Smith paints. I could use a mixture that wasn't too watery or too dry to paint in the lashes and brows. This was still possible with the Cotman paints, but involved much more tinkering to avoid lifting the layers beneath. As for the background, both of these paint sets were capable of mixing warm, deep greens and olives that I saw in the reference, but I wasn't happy with either background. This was a me problem, not a supply problem. I'm used to rendering foliage as light on dark, which is not an option with pure watercolor. I thought about using gouache, but decided to save the rendering for color pencil instead. Speaking of color pencils, my Polychromos have been a staple from the beginning of my channel. They're hard enough to maintain a sharp point, but also pigmented enough to cover dark values. A curious thing I noticed, though, was that they performed differently on the Cotman and Daniel Smith sides of this study. I found it easier to get an even layer and to fill in the paper's texture on the Cotman side. This made rendering the grass a breeze, which is surprising since this is a cold-pressed paper. My theory is that the thicker, more opaque pigment and filler from the watercolors on this half filled in the texture and created a smooth surface that was great for pencils. I was also able to add the brightest white gel pen highlights quickly here. Meanwhile, the Daniel Smith side required many more layers and a generous amount of buffing with my blending stump. Even so, I can still see some lighter areas peeking through my darks, and the edges of the grass blades just aren't as well defined. The gel pen also struggled to overcome the texture and deposit any ink. I ended up relayering white color pencil on top to get the fairy lights to pop here like they did in the Cotman side. Still, in the end, I was able to bring both halves of the study to a similar level of finish. Here's the final study. I'm happy I revisited the Cotman set using cold-pressed cotton paper, and remembered some key differences between this student set and my Daniel Smith Essential set. Here's a cheat sheet that breaks down the qualities of each set. For me personally, I prefer the Daniel Smith colors for their pigmentation, glazing capabilities, and dry time, but your preferences might be different. Depending on where you are on your own watercolor journey, your budget, and your style, the Cotman set might be a better match. Just know you can reach a similar level of finish with either set. I should also mention that I ran out of the original alizarin crimson hue and ultramarine pans in my Cotman set, so I've refilled them with the Cotman tube versions since those are what I had on hand. The tube paints re-wet easier, but otherwise had the same characteristics as the pans. Anyway, thanks for watching to the end. Of course, feel free to leave any questions you might have in the comments, and I hope you created something that brought you joy this week. I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!